Hi, this is Jeff Welch with Brandman University. Today our presentation is going to be about avoiding common mistakes in writing and formatting for APA. Our objective will be to help students that are unfamiliar or new to the APA writing style learn to avoid some common mistakes that writers always have to deal with. The first thing that I'd like to mention is what is probably the best resource on the internet for formatting really in any of the three major styles, the APA, the MLA, or the Chicago style. And that is a great resource presented by Purdue University's English department called the OWL at Purdue. If you can't remember that long address, it's always easy to just type into Google the OWL at Purdue and you'll go right to it. A few of the examples you'll see in this presentation are from the OWL at Purdue, and they have really the best references for any of these writing formats. There are three common writing formats. In fact, there are many writing formats, but the most common are MLA from the Modern Language Association. Usually this means English teachers, foreign language teachers, and a few other university departments. The next most common style is what we call the Chicago style, and that is typical of history departments and other related fields. And then we have the APA. Unfortunately for us, the MLA and the APA are not the same, but they actually look a lot alike. And this causes quite a lot of difficulty for students because many students enter college being very familiar with MLA, but not really very familiar with the other formats. There are some very distinct similarities between the two styles, but it's important to pay close attention to APA and realize that it is in fact different. So, the APA format, where does it come from? The APA format stands for the American Psychological Association. The official APA style website is apastyle.org. The field of education has adopted the APA styles as its official format, and nearly all education resources are formatted using APA. At Brandman University, all education courses are required to use APA as their writing style. It's therefore quite important that you become very familiar and very comfortable with some of the specifics of the format. And again, it's quite different from other formats that you may be used to. The first feature you'll notice at the very top of your first page of your paper is what in the APA is called the running head. And the running head is just simply a shortened version of your title. You'll notice that it's in all caps, it's up to 50 characters, and it may be shorter than your title. You may leave some words out. There are a few different tricks to doing this, but basically it's to kind of give your reader an idea what that paper is about. And you'll also notice that we see page 1 there at the top as well. The next thing to notice is our title. About the middle of the page, you'll include a title. The title can be up to 12 words. It should be on no more than 1 or 2 lines. Under that, you'll notice that you'll include your first and last name, but if you have a degree already or a title, you're going to leave that off. And then below your name, you're going to include your institution, in this case, probably Brandman University. Now, one of the things I should note about this title is that it is not in a fancy, very large font. In fact, it's just in your standard typed font, typically 12-point Times New Roman. We don't do a lot of fancy things, as we'll talk about in a moment, in the APA style, so don't do them here in your title either. The header. After the first page, every page will have a header that looks very similar to what you see here. It might be similar to your running head from your first page. It might even be a little bit shorter. It will also include a page number in the top right-hand corner, and you notice this is page 2. Underneath the header on the second page of your paper, you might include an abstract. Now this will actually depend a little bit on your teacher. If you're writing a very short paper, the abstract will oftentimes be optional or not required. Pay attention to what your instructor's instructions are for this particular feature of the APA format. In any case, the abstract you should know about because you will encounter them sooner or later, and probably sooner or later you'll be writing them. An abstract is a very short summary of your paper's main points, its arguments, its conclusions. You want to be very brief, in fact 150 to 250 words. If it goes over 150 words, you're really pushing it. Oftentimes people will include keywords underneath the abstract to let them know, let the reader know what this paper is kind of about. In this case, we have writing, abstract, header, references, some of the features of the APA format that again you're going to become familiar with. Fancy fonts and formatting. It's a great title. We're not going to use them in the APA though. Now, many students like to spend a lot of time messing with fonts, changing things around, turning it to 14 point, doing this or that. In fact, in APA, we don't do any of that. It's actually quite simple, quite maybe even boring, you might say. In general, you're going to want to stick with Times New Roman 12 point, in other words, whatever came with your word processor, and usually 1-inch margins all around. It's a very simple format. We don't want to get complicated, and this helps the reader to just focus literally on your text. We're not going to be worried about figuring what you're writing or whatever. You'll also notice at the top of your first page of text, in this case it's page 3 because we included an abstract in our example, this includes a copy of your title. That's standard to the APA format. So that title is just a word-for-word copy of the title that you had on the very front page of your document. If you're writing a complex paper, you might want to explore some more of the APA heading and format structure. In fact, there's quite a lot of layers of headings, but if you're writing a short paper of just a few pages, you'll often not necessarily need to be concerned with these. So you can skip that until you get to a more complex paper, and you'll want to pay close attention at that time. In-text citations are quite important in the APA. In fact, they're all in text. One of the big differences from the Chicago style, for example, is that in the Chicago style, typically students will write in what are called foot or end notes, where there'll be a superscript number or letter or something in the text, and then at the bottom of the page or at the end of the text, there will be a list of notes giving more information about those particular quotes or references. For an in-text citation in APA, we're generally going to include just the author's name and the date. In some cases, we might include a page or paragraph number or other information, and it depends a little bit on what you're doing. So again, referring to the OWL at Purdue for the details, depending on what you're doing, will be helpful. If it's a short article, oftentimes the author's name and the date will be sufficient to draw the reader to what you need them to know. One of the things you'll also notice is that in the case of the APA, the citations are what I would call inside the sentence. You'll notice that at the end of the second line on our example here, it says Welch 2014, and then there's a period just outside the parentheses. Well, in the MLA format, it wouldn't look like this. So this is a common mistake that many students make, is they'll actually set this citation outside of the period. In the Chicago style, likewise, the superscript number 1 here would also be outside of the sentence as well. It would be after the period. So we want to be careful how we're doing this and making sure that we do it correctly. We want to also be sure that we keep things very, very formal. The APA is not designed to be a flowery format. It is not designed to be a format that is like a journalistic in style or designed to draw your interest in. It's really supposed to be kind of just all the facts. It's formal. It's getting you actual research information, hopefully practical, that you can use. It's not a format that you're going to use for writing books of reader interest, you might say. If it's important for you for your job, then you want to get right to the point. That's kind of the idea of the format. So writing is formal, it's third person. You're not going to put yourself into the paper. You're not going to say a lot of I's or things like that. And the only time you might do something like that is when you're expressly stating an opinion, especially if you were asked to do so by your instructor. Your reference page is also a very important part of your APA paper. You notice we have a couple of examples here, and I have 4 different examples for you to look at. And again, you also notice that we still have our header at the top of this page as well. The format for writing an APA reference is quite simple. It's last name, and then you'll see first and middle initial. You will see the year. You will see the title of the item, whether it's an article or a book. You will then see the name of the journal, in the case of a journal in our first example, and pages whatever to whatever. Depending on the particulars. In our second example, we see something very similar. In this case, it's an electronic reference, so it's an electronic journal. You'll notice at the end we see what we call the URL or the DOI, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. In the third example, we have a book. The difference in the book, of course, is we have the city name and we have the publisher name. In the final example I have a version of the book I'm writing for this particular presentation. Of course, I'm not really writing a book, but you get the idea. Welch, J.M., 2014. How to Write for APA, Modesto, which is where I gave the presentation, and the Brandman University Press. Here are 2 examples of what we call URLs or DOIs. The URL format is what's called a universal resource locator, and the idea with the URL is It's an object that you can go to on the internet and you can find the exact information that you found before. So it's just a web page reference. In this case, I'm referencing an article back at the OWL at Purdue about, of course, how to write for APA. In the bottom example, we have a very similar structure, but instead of the URL, we have what's called a DOI. A DOI is a document information number. And many articles now are providing these, and it's an easy way to reference what that specific article is and to find it again and again and again when a URL is not always useful. So these are our preferred formats. DOI is actually a little bit better if you can find it. If not, try and find the URL. And what we really want to avoid is something like this. In this example, we see a very complex URL, and it's in fact not a useful one. In this case, this is a URL that references the Brandman library, which is actually the Chapman library since we share them in common. And this is actually a session URL. Now, if you click on this URL, you will get nothing. You will get a reference back to the Brandman library or the Chapman library, and you will receive no useful information. So at the time the student that was using this was doing their research, this was the URL they saw in their URL address bar. But in fact, it's useless anytime after that session. Many students turn in URLs with a very similar look to this one. If you see something that says libproxy or .chapman.edu, it's probably not the right URL. Another thing that's a kind of personal pet peeve of mine is what I like to call lazy quoting. In lazy quoting, students will oftentimes take a quote and then they'll kind of rearrange the quote and maybe change a few words here and there, and they kind of think that this is okay. In fact, it's not. If you look at our example here, we see a quote at the top, which is actually quoted correctly, although the student left off the correct citation. In the middle of the document, we see words taken out of the paper, but in fact they're not in quote marks. At the bottom, we see an actual quote. So in this case, the student sort of partially did it right at the top, didn't do it right at all in the middle, and then did it basically correctly at the bottom. Students will often do this. They'll take a quote from a book and they'll rearrange it and think, well, that made it mine. Well, no, it really didn't. You really should be very, very careful when you're quoting or when you're paraphrasing to make sure that the words you're writing down are really your words. Now, you can summarize another person's thoughts and say such and such a person said this or believes this or argued this. That's fine. But we want to be very, very careful that we don't accidentally plagiarize. And why do we want to be careful of that? Well, you're going to get caught. The example that you saw a moment ago was from the website Turnitin.com. Nearly all Brandman writing assignments are sent through Turnitin.com, and if you plagiarize, you will very likely get caught. And this could be very, very difficult for your future at Brandman. In fact, leading to all kinds of negative potential consequences. So this is a repeat of a slide from earlier in the presentation, and just a quick reminder. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as many teachers are concerned, the best source for formatting and writing on the internet is the OWL at Purdue. Very, very useful. All kinds of references for basically every single problem you're going to have for APA, MLA, or Chicago style. And of course, we're in the Department of Education, so in the case of Brandman University's Department of Education, like most education departments at most universities, we are going to be using the APA. So get very familiar with it, get used to it, practice it, and you'll do great.